having that. So Jenkins says, you've got a superior figure in one in the population of less superior on this island. What will happen? Well, of course, he says, the shipwrecked sailor will become their king, ruler. He will have loads of wives, and he will father lots of children who will rule everything, and so forth. That's natural stuff. None of his readers would have a problem with that. But if you came back in 100 years, what would you find? Would you find an island of white people? There's the whole population of black people with this one white king. Jenkins says, of course not. He might have lots and lots of children who were halfway, mixed breed or mixed color or whatever, but they would simply be, every generation they would mate with those of the normal population, and this effect, this difference, remember he's targeting Darwin's idea of small variations, would be blended away into nothing. So it's a bit like if you had a pot of, I don't know, say a pot of black paint, and we put a teaspoonful of white paint in it, then mix it all up for about half an hour. What will we have? A pot of black paint. So that's Jenkins' argument. Mr. Darwin's theory will not work, even if you did have an indisputably superior individual. So what? You will just blend it away, nothing will happen. So Mr. Darwin's theory will not work. That was it. But Darwin was quite shaken by this. Ooh, that's very difficult work. But of course, it turns out that they were already, by this time, it was known, remember, genes and DNA are not been thought of yet, far away. But they did know enough that some things are inherited in ways that are not this blendy mix of paints. For example, eye color. Right? A person with blue eyes and a person with brown eyes gets married. What do they have? Do they have a little girl with one blue eye and one brown eye? No. Are they sort of half blue and brown? No. It's one eye color or the other, usually brown, which is dominant. And same with other things like people who are born with 6 fingers instead of the normal 5. And by the way, the author of Messages was one of these. He was born with 6 fingers. Anyway, those people, when they get married to people with the normal 5, do their babies have 5.5? No. They have either 5 or 6. It's not blended. So there were lots of things that were already known in their day, that where inheritance didn't work the way that Jenkins assumed. Nevertheless, inheritance was still so vaguely understood that this seemed like a powerful objection. Darwin pointed out, of course, that even if you did have a superior individual who mated with the other population of animals, whatever it is, that one would still be better off than average. And so let's say it's a cheetah. Okay, let's leave racism out. Let's say it's a cheetah, a fast cheetah, or an extra fast cheetah, and the normal fast cheetah mate, then you'd expect the offspring to be a little bit faster than it would have been otherwise. So fastness is still going to promote and spread the population. Okay, now I will introduce to you the main event, usually when the reception of Darwin's theory is discussed. This is always sort of the big moment, the famous episode, which is a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. You don't need to remember the name of this society. It's a scientific meeting, a public meeting, at the Oxford University Museum, which is here, in 1860. And our 2 friends, Bishop Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley, were some of the hundreds of people present. These are caricatures, okay, which are meant to be popular, from Vanity Fair. There's Wilberforce, who, by the way, you can see how he's holding his hand. His nickname was Soapy Sam, which actually, every book I read has a different explanation. One of the explanations is that he was always wringing his hands while speaking, and it looked like he was washing his hands. which at least does fit this caricature, so maybe that's why he's not so concerned. The other theory is that he was such a good debater that he was as slippery as a piece of soap and he couldn't really get a hold on his veto. Anyway, so here's the usual version of the story. I'll tell you that first, and then I'll tell you a funny little one. Okay? So, according to the more legendary, more popular version, Wilberforce stood up at the end of the session and famously said something to the effect of, "Can Mr. Huxley tell us whether it is on his grandmother or his grandfather's side that he claims descent from an ape?" Ooh, that's Huxley's completely burnt. Huxley stands up and, again, quoting the legendary version, issues an absolutely killing rebuttal and says, "Sir, I would far rather be descended from a miserable ape than from a man who uses his intelligence and ability to bring ridicule into a serious scientific discussion." So, Wilberforce was completely smashed, right? Well, here's a film clip from one of the many documentaries about this whole famous episode, and let's see how it's portrayed.
Through your grandfather or your grandmother that you claim descent from?
I stood up, very quiet, very grave, and said my say with perfect good temper.
If the question is put to me, would I rather have a miserable ape for a grandfather, or a man highly intelligent, possessed of great means of influence, and yet who employed these faculties and that influence for the mere purpose of introducing ridicule into a grave scientific discussion? I unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape.
You didn't. I said that, or something very like that. How dare you attack a live bishop in public? Have you no respect for the purple waistcoat? Lady Bruce fainted had to be carried from the room, and then Admiral Fitzroy got to his feet.
This is Captain Fitzroy.
Fitzroy.
Just there.
Oh my.
Oh my, yes. This is the way the story is usually represented, exactly as I said at the beginning. Clash between science and religion, because it sells better. It makes sexier documentaries. But how reliable is that? In fact, the evidence we have for this famous event is really sketchy. No one was there recording what happened, and most people wrote about it decades later after it had become some kind of famous event. And of course, let me tell you something that will not surprise any of you. When you hear about an argument from one of the participants, how good did they sound? They sound fantastic. They devastated their opponent. They crushed them with some unstoppable objection. Huxley, this version comes from a letter Huxley wrote. When I read that letter, I have this reaction, oh come on, that's just too good to be true. Have you ever had an argument with someone and then later, as you replay the argument in your head, you thought of the perfect thing to say, you wish you had said to them? Well, it's happened to all of us. And then maybe when you tell people later, you kind of slip that version into what happened. I rather suspect that's what happened to you. It doesn't quite ring true. As far as we know, and let me put it into context, this was a long series of talks over a very hot weekend. This was not an event about Darwin or evolution. It was a scientific meeting with lots of people giving talks. Immediately before this Wilberforce Huxley event, there had been this unbelievably long and boring talk by an American lecturer on Mr. Darwin's theory applied to European history. Everyone was nodding off and falling asleep. The boredom was pretty hot at the lunch, a bit like some people right now. And Wilberforce stood up at the end of this boring talk and tried to lighten the mood with a little joke, wake people up, rather than, as we saw in the film, sort of hammering Darwinism and Huxley. He just made a little joke, descended from an claim to be descended from ape, and so forth. Darwin's other friend, Hooker, the botanist, was also there, sitting beside Huxley. In his letter to Darwin, guess who the winner is? Hooker. In his version of events, he crushed Wilberforce, and then nobody heard what Huxley had to say. So, we can't really know what happened, but something of the type happened. So what we have now is probably more legend than reality. But we'll never know for sure. Okay, let's move on to oh yes, I want to mention what else is on this slide. Now, we think that Darwin's origin of species is so controversial. Of course, it was controversial, but you have to put things in perspective and in the context of the time. If you only take one thing out and look at it, you have no way of assessing how big an event or how big a deal it was. So there's this other book called Essays and Reviews, published in 1860. It was a series of essays by a number of Oxford clerics. Oxford clerics, not Wilberforce, okay? He was an enemy of these people. Very liberal. They were bringing in the latest views of German biblical scholarship and other liberal and scientific interpretations of Christianity and so forth. Very, very, very liberal version. That was 1,000 times more controversial and more publicly debated than Darwin's book. It was massive, massive big seller as well. I think some of those people had lost their jobs. It was a huge, huge big deal. So Darwin's book is, yes, partly debated at the time, but it's not the biggest issue going on. Okay, but luckily for Darwin, it's not his book alone. Other evidence begins to appear at just the right time, or at least for people to look on his book and his theory favorably. One of these is by, I hope you still remember him, naturalist Henry Walter Bates. This is his book published in 1863. That's Bates on the left there being attacked by toucans in the Amazon jungle. Remember, Bates was the friend of Wallace. They went out to the Amazon together. And Bates stayed there. Anyway, he came back with a vast collection of specimens, particularly insects and butterflies. And Bates had a discovery, which was that in many parts of the Amazon, there were butterflies that had certain bright colorations, and that basically either tasted or smelled disgusting to birds, not to us. So birds would avoid them because they were yuck. And you could prove this by having birds in cages and offer them some of these. They would bite once and never again had these particularly brightly colored butterflies. Nasty. The birds recognize that and they don't forget. But they often found a different species of butterfly that lived in the same area as one of these nasty tasting ones, which was not related, even from a different family of butterflies, but whose coloration was so similar, as you see in these diagrams, that sometimes he couldn't tell which was which. But they didn't taste disgusting. They just looked like others and taste disgusting. How did they get to look like that? Remember, it's a bit like one of those tiger beetles. Butterflies are stupid. They do not design their colors for any intentional purpose. So the ones that taste fine but look like the disgusting ones, how do they get to look that way? Bates used Darwin's new theory and argued that it was the only way to explain how these unrelated, distant or very distantly related butterflies looked almost identical, and they only occurred in the same area as the nasty tasting ones. When you found that family butterfly anywhere else, completely different kind. And so there were many different kinds. He called it mimicry. And to this day it is still called, it's named after him, Batesian mimicry. He argued that Darwin's theory of natural selection was the only way to explain how these butterflies had evolved to look like their nasty tasting neighbors. In other words, those that happen to look just a little bit like the nasty tasting ones would be avoided more often, on average, than all the other things that were being eaten by birds. And this would form a little bit of a bias, whereby those that resembled the nasty tasting ones just a little bit would survive a bit more. And then over time this provided a bias for them to gradually take on an appearance that looked more like the nasty tasting. There were many, many examples of this happening in different animals. Darwin, when he read this, was delighted. This was exactly what he was looking for. Somebody to go out into the field, do new science, and use his theory to explain something that otherwise could not be explained. So that was very welcome from Darwin's perspective. Here's another thing that's found, a new fossil. I've shown you endless fossils in this module, so you shouldn't be too surprised. And actually this one, on the face of it, to be honest, big deal. It's a feather. So it's not like it's an amazing, gigantic slope the size of a bus, something like that. But this feather did cause a sensation, at least amongst paleontologists, because this feather was found in rocks that were believed to be far, far too old for birds. Remember, they knew by this time quite accurately when different kinds of organisms appeared in the fossil record. Right? So they have all these eras characterized by different groups. Birds are found up here, and then suddenly somebody says, "Look, I found a feather down here." No, must be a mistake. There were no birds in there. We haven't found any birds in between. That just can't be right. It doesn't fit. Well, that could have been well argued, but the next year, this was found. The Archaeopteryx. A creature with outlines of feathers still attached to the body. There could be no more debate that these rocks at this early age did contain a creature with feathers. And I hope this won't be shocking to you, but of course, only birds have feathers, right? I've never seen a fish with feathers. It's obvious. This is one of the most famous fossils in the world, even today. That always has been. This is a fossil that was so amazing because it had all of these features that had never before conceived. Darwin had predicted that different groups of living things that appear to be quite different from the others, isolated out on some distant branch, you might say, of the tree of life, except nobody would accept that it was a branch because they didn't know anything in between. They just had groups placed according to their similarity. But birds didn't seem to be connected to anything else. I mean, they have skeletons and backbones and so forth. They are animals, and they can be roughly categorized, but they did seem to be one of the most isolated groups of vertebrates. People said, well, they're not reptiles, they're not amphibians, they're not mammals, they're not fish, they're just separate. This creature, the Archaeopteryx, however, has features that are intermediate, halfway between reptiles and birds. If you look closely, it has a long bony tail, like a reptile. But no bird has a bony tail. Birds just have feathers sticking out. It's lightweight. Right. In its jaws, it has teeth, little teeth for catching prey. No bird in the world has teeth. Those are reptile teeth. So it has things that are intermediate, that are both bird things and reptile things. Claws, it has claws on the ends of its wings. Almost no birds have that. Now, well, I'll show you a short David Attenborough clip about it. But first, I want to tell you the most surprising thing about this. and I hope it's something that, well, that will support you. You've all heard throughout your entire lives, I'm sure, that dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. And I'm going to tell you that that is not true. The dinosaurs, you were told, went extinct. They did not. Dinosaurs are not extinct. I'm not joking. You don't believe, I'm not telling you a joke. Don't believe me, Google that data. The dinosaurs did not go extinct. Just most of them. One family of them survived. And they are called birds. It's not a joke. Birds are dinosaurs. Literally. So the next, as I said, one family of them. The next time you tuck into your crispy duck or your chicken rice, remember,
dinosaur.
Dinosaur.
Ayam dinosaur. Sino is dinosaur.
Literally. Think of the other features of birds. There you are. Yum, yum. You are tasting literal dinosaur. What does a bird's legs look like? Ever notice? They're covered in scales. And they lay eggs, like reptiles. And the chemical structure of feathers is actually the same as scales. So anyway, the point being that Darwin said that these isolated groups, eventually fossils will be found that fill in the gaps between these. And luckily, at exactly the time the debate was raging over his book, one was found exactly in the middle of the gap between birds and reptiles. Okay, now I'll show you the data.
That's why they say chicken like with T-Rex.
That feather had been found by men quarrying this limestone near the little town of Solomon. The stone had been laid down about 150 million years ago at the bottom of the shallow lagoon, and its fine, even texture made it ideal for use in lithographic printing. But that texture also makes it a superb preserver of fossils. The feather tantalized the world of science. What sort of creature could it possibly have come from? Well, immediately there was a huge search mounted in these quarries. And even now, it's almost impossible to resist the temptation of pulling down almost every boulder you see, and then opening it like a book to look at each unopened page to see whether maybe it contains yet another fossil. And after nearly a year, in 1861, in this very quarry, they found what they had been looking for. A skeleton, a foot or so long, surrounded by feathers. They called it Archaeopteryx, ancient bird. Its skull was missing, but then another complete skeleton was found. The creature had limbs of equal length, so that if it hadn't been for those feathers, it might have been taken for a four-legged runner, like a lizard. Its head, too, was very reptilian, with tiny teeth along its bony jaws. And the front limbs had 3 toes apiece, each toe ending with a claw. The tail was supported by a bony rod, an extension of the backbone, running down the middle. But all around, there are the miraculously detailed impressions of feathers. In some places, it's even possible to see the filaments on either side of a central quill. So those front limbs with claws are not the legs of a lizard, but the wings of a bird. So perfect are these fossils that we can make a pretty confident reconstruction of the living animal. But could this, the earliest of birds, flap its wings? Its breastbone has no keel on it to carry large muscles, so its wing beats at best could only have been very feeble. It probably depended for the most part on gliding. The long toes on its feet had a good grasp, both forwards and backwards, so that it would have had no difficulty in perching on branches. and those claws on its wing doubtless helped it to steady itself as it clambered around. In all the world today, there is only one living creature that has claws on its wings, and this is it. This is the hoatzin, not an adult bird, but a chick, and it only possesses claws on its wings for a week or so. But while it does, it gives a vivid hint of how the first birds may have moved about in their trees. Maybe the ancestors of Archaeopteryx took to the trees because some hungry reptiles roamed below looking for a meal. The young hoatzin faces just such dangers today, for its home in the swamps of Venezuela is haunted by crocodiles and caiman, and reptiles very like them certainly prowled the swamps and forests 150 million years ago.
Okay, yes. So, there you have it from Sir David himself. Now, of course, we have many more specimens and species, other than just that one species, the Archaeopteryx. Now we have large families of these probably gliding feathered dinosaurs. And further back, feathers have gone back far beyond these bird-like dinosaurs to basically, how should I say it, fuzzy dinosaurs, a little bit fluffy. They don't have wings or anything, it's just scales can quite easily turn into feathers. They're made of the same chemical substance. So there were lots of dinosaurs that instead of being these sleek, smooth, glossy, scaled things you see in Jurassic Park or whatever movie, there were many that were actually had either fluffed out scales or some that turned to feathers on some parts or large parts of their bodies because it's excellent insulation. So the first feathers probably were scales that were involved for insulation purposes. And they may have also been like rests, show covers of trap girls or something like that. We wouldn't be surprised by anything like that. So there were lots of feathered dinosaurs, and the Archaeopteryx and the other candidates for the ancestors of today's baby birds had definitely gliding, at least wings. You can also tell from the feathers the fact that they're longer on one side than the other. They definitely generated legs. These are birds that did go through the air, but they probably just glided at first. I mean, true powered flight probably came much later, thousands of years later. Okay, on that point, we're not too afraid of all the dinosaurs outside, which, by the way, they're everywhere. So I've been talking about minor birds all through this module, waiting for this moment to shock you. The fact that those little minor birds pecking the rice off the edge of your table at the food court are dinosaurs, and that's what's kind of fun anyway. They've been there your whole life, you just ignore them.
Yeah, and you
Have
watch
another look. Look at their legs. Look at their eyes. And try to get used to the shocking idea that that's actually a dinosaur. It is. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break. And I've got some copies of Darwin Lecture.
How you go celebrate it? I think I never celebrate it. Huh? No celebration, okay. Yeah, whereas this year we never celebrate Bell's birthday also, right? Yeah. That's August, yeah, I know, like this last. Oh, yeah, because I remember we used to bring a cake to scare her.
Oh, but we don't know that there's some.
We celebrate Ben's one. Ben's is the only one that celebrates. I don't give a shit about birthday. Can you spend your 21st locally overseas?
Jeff also what?
You spend your 21st overseas, right?
No, my birthday was in March.
Where's your birthday also?
27.
For what?
March.
Oh, yours also March.
Ken also March,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Me, you and Ken.
Can I remember first? Last time our class all combined.
You're all still in KR, right?
Yeah.
I will go command.
I only this sem.
Huh?
Only this thing.
You ain't never.
But you're doing extra sem or what? Hannah is doing exchange this sem. He's leaving on 24th
End of
March.
this month.
Yeah.
So late, huh?
Yeah. Germany mah. April.
Actually, I don't think they stay almost here. No point cut off so high.
Huh?
Cut off so high.
I don't believe it's 45.
I got 34 lah, but like suddenly my like the day I checked 34. Then next day I checked more. I think they remove
Yeah, they remove everything. Cannot see.
Oh, I thought it's because of F for your time.
But you got tell your people come, right?
Max. Block points how much max?
12.
What give tough? I enough to stay here. 46 here. Oh, quick. Saya.
I wasn't able to get 12.
Really like what? You all must have seen.
I asked me when I want.
Our place. Actually, I think you'll make a good sport team. You won't fight like.
But that's crazy.
Yeah, but it's damn stress. Don't do it.
Like someone, yeah, it's more. I swear press is more slack than that. That's like, I don't want I want to do FSP.
A lot of expectation now.
I want to do FSP.
I need to get fun. Get fun to this from this semester. Then we'll see. I put my lenses in the wrong way. When I'm sleeping, standard lor.
Yeah, I'm so happy. So when I saw the plot, I was like, oh, 4, 5, 6. I was like legit excited. Oh.
Then I just study it.
Huh? But our red drinks finish so fast.
So I just buy you apple juice and Yakult, make yourself like 1 carton then 1 6-pack of Yakult.
No, but it must be the fresh blender one. I think the normal commercial apple juice like taste of shit.
He said one thing. Then go drop.
Last time AC they say I like a fan, because I keep rotating.
Anyway, it's also
But I
fire
sleep. But I always sleep at AC because school wake up at like what 6 AM.
You sleep when?
What the during the AC ah.
Oh. You know I sleep in JC. I just like my class right, you know like then fucked up on the lecture system like the class got assigned seats so my class always sit in front. Yeah, I always think easy I sit first. Then I look at the lecturer like what means I just
The hell? Horrible sia.
like my chemistry right, I still remember like chapter 2 to 6 my notes blank on it. Can't exam I fucking panic, I look at my notes, hey fuck must fill in ah.
Oh, the banks ah.
Yeah, like, oh shit.
My camp sucks. I love B, I very happy. I hate camp.
Yes, I should be a pharmacist. Yeah, like. Yeah, in pharmacy, it's fun.
Why are some other science related?
Okay, thank you. I forgot to show you this slide of a fuzzy dinosaur. I didn't use the expression, but closely, this is a feathered, this is a reconstruction of a feathery one. And just to dwell on this, because I think the example might help you. Please, break it over. I said that scales have turned into feathers. Well, this is something that you can see the next time actually you go to your local wet market or food court and you see some chickens or ducks hanging from the window. Oh no, you can't see that because they've had all their feathers ripped off. No, don't do that. Anyway, the next time you see a bird, as in my first set of a chicken steak, what do you see? When the scales stop, the feathers begin, and vice versa. But some breeds of poultry and pigeons, people making all these crazy breeds as I showed you before, sometimes they breed ones which don't have scales on their legs. They have feathery legs. It's something that can be bred. They look to me awful. They're really dirty. Well, you can imagine what their legs are covered in. Not very nice. But anyway, so the interchange between scales and feathers is very common. The other thing that was that one of you came and asked me about in the break is, well, what about these early bird things or semi-birds like archaeopteryx and others? Could they really fly? I don't really know. Looks like they probably could just glide. We know lots of gliding animals, right? There are lizards. We have them here on NUS. Gliding lizards, gliding squirrels, and other gliding mammals. There's even gliding snakes. So gliding is something that happens many, many times in life. For these animals, with very lightweight, feathery coverings on their wings, okay, they can glide, but they can do something that a flying squirrel, or so-called, they're gliding squirrels, okay? The gliding squirrel can't do. They have that membrane that stretches between all their limbs. They can't flap. Oh, bats can, of course. Let's not talk about bats. So, they can't flap, but a gliding feathery dinosaur like this, which glides between the trees, is perfectly free to give it a little flap or two if it's not going to reach the next tree, even though it's a glider. So you can well imagine that those that have more muscle in their breast area, the muscles that will occasionally give it an extra flap, might do a little bit better than those who are a bit weaker and don't reach the tree and fall down to the ground and so you can imagine that if this is the context in which you have an animal that glides, but is capable of giving an extra push over time, over thousands of years, and you can well imagine that some of those might be rather good at flapping for a bit of extra distance. And so gradually onwards to what we have today, true flying birds, which can flap and fly for length of time. In fact, there are some birds that don't land even once in a whole year. Okay. Let's move on from dinosaurs to the American fossilist Asa Gray, which I hope you recall, Darwin's friend and colleague in Boston, USA. He was very pro-Darwin, pro-Darwin's theory, but not completely. Just like Huxley, he had plenty of his own misgivings. Things that he agreed with and things he didn't agree with. Huxley was a bit of a free thinker. But Asa Gray was not. He was very serious about his Christian faith. And he didn't like this part of Darwin's theory that there was, although Darwin talked about the creator many times in his book, it didn't really actually seem that there was anything for the creator to do in Darwin's system. It sounded as if, according to Darwin, that the creator had simply designed living things to work in this way, and they work. No more intervention required. A lot of people didn't like that part about Darwin's theory. They were used to a view of nature in which there was a requirement for the deity to intervene from time to time, to play a role in nudging, changing nature. And Gray was like one of these. So although he was a huge supporter of Darwin in America, he had his own version of Darwinism in which, you know, the little tiny variations that we've talked about before, where do they come from? Remember, Darwin couldn't explain, they just always appeared. Every little thing is one is a little bit different. So where do the little variations come from? Darwin says no different, they just appear. They're always there, and they're there for natural selection to pick up on or not, depending on the circumstances. Gray said, God makes them. God makes the little variations in this way or that way, and this provides a way for Gray and others like him, who think like him, to allow God to work within Darwin's theory of evolution. So you would say they're having their cake and eating it too, is the expression we would use. They're sort of combining two different views together. This is very popular. A lot of people like this view. Darwin didn't. He didn't want to accept that, but tough. That's the way a lot of people preferred to take it on board. They could take on this whole theory. Okay. Now the other thing that happened very coincidentally to Darwin in this whole debate was that the French-American explorer and adventurer, we'll call him a naturalist, call him an adventurer, Paul Cheval, published a book in London called Explorations and Adventures in Africa, which was all about his unbelievable, and when I say unbelievable, I mean literally unbelievable, adventures with an animal that almost no one knew anything about, the gorilla. This was the least known of the great apes. Gibbons, orangutans, chimpanzees, people have been seeing these in Europe for centuries. Gorilla, unknown. So even just skeletons of them have barely been seen and analyzed by Richard Owen and so forth. So Shadu arrived with a whole cartload of gorillas in pickle barrels, preserved gorilla skeletons, gorilla skins, and what's more, his accounts of his adventures hunting this gigantic monster ape in the jungle. And this is a picture from the front of his book, where a gorilla is charging out of the forest. Now, I know to you, with all the endless CGI movies we see, this is utterly tame and boring, but to the Victorian audience, this giant man-like monster coming out of the forest, this is really scary. X-rated stuff. It's hot, but now, of course, it's totally tame. And he's there, about to manfully defend himself, armed only with a gun. And, well, yeah, I mean, we can't sympathize with this anymore, but that's Shadu shooting down this monster, as he describes them, monsters, about to attack him, and he shoots them down. So this caused a sort of gorilla fever throughout London, and then throughout English-speaking world, gorillas became very widely discussed, and it's the perfect time, just when everyone's discussing Darwin's theory and the possibility of human beings being descended from some kind of ape creatures, here comes a new one. And Shadu's stories about these man-like monsters charging through the forest and attacking him. So here's some examples. So on the left, this is a Victorian cartoon where the man who waits at the door to announce all the those invited to the party might say, Lord Halifax, ladies and gentlemen, Lord Halifax comes in. And here his hair is standing on end because the next person visiting is Mr. Gorilla, as he says at the, you can't really see the caption at the bottom there. So notice, what would happen if gorillas were to enter high society? At the same time, this lady, whose name I'm sorry I've forgotten, in the center there, was also on display in Victorian Britain. She had a rare condition where she was, there are still people who have this, covered with bodily hair. And she was displayed as, and put, you had to pay money to go into a circus show and see her, poor lady. And she was put on show as the missing link. Actually, she's just a normal human being, but with a rare genetic disorder that makes her covered in bodily hair. Well, anyway, she has a sad fate. Although she in fact married her manager, they are. That's me. Poor lady. She's almost like his slave, but also she married him. Anyway, so people link that. She seemed to be a halfway link between humans and gorillas or apes. And now the other thing is, of course, you've all heard of King Kong and that so-called fantasy story, right? That comes from this time, which is that when gorillas were first introduced to the public, they were introduced as ferocious giant monster and so forth, which eventually evolved into a naturally giant gorilla called King Kong. And, well, there's still making movies about King Kong, right? Well, what's happened to the image of the gorilla is that when it was first introduced to Victorian society, it was introduced as a ferocious monster, the opposite from us, the noble, intelligent, civilized creature that we think we are. And the opposite was this aggressive monster animal. And that evolved into the idea of King Kong, although the idea of the movie is actually a sweet guy. He's supposed to be monster. The same was true with the orangutan, which also had the bestial image. But look what happens through time. When you get to the mid-1970s, when David Attenborough, in one of the most, it was voted in the UK a few years ago, the most famous TV moment ever, well, in the UK anyway, when David Attenborough was seen in Africa with a group of wild mountain gorillas who were accustomed to being observed by scientists. And then they were sort of a group of youngsters cuddling with him and tickling him and playing with his shoelaces. And he talks to the camera about, isn't it a tragedy that in fact the gorilla has been represented as this aggressive monster, when in fact they are very gentle and intelligent creatures. And in fact, we are the aggressive monsters, not them. So the image of the gorilla is not completely around from where it started. That's going on. Of course. So at the beginning, the gorilla drops into London just at the place where it's going on. And for those who thought that it was ridiculous to think that human beings could have evolved, suddenly a new creature appears which is very human-like in looking. This was not missed by a lot of people. People were like, oh gosh, this gives a lot more credibility to Mr. Darwin's theories than might have originally thought. Well, Richard Owen, the great anatomist, mentioned many times, started a new debate. He wanted to argue that human beings were even more different than all other scientists and naturalists would accept. He wanted to make human beings quite separate. And he analyzed the brains of chimpanzees and humans and other primates. And this is what he came up with, this table. I hope it's not too unintelligible. Just look at it for a second. Okay? This is the kind of table that we've seen many times. Over on the far left, right, under the group, mammals, all of these different subclasses and so forth. And here what the Victorians call the primates, the quadrumana. But look what he's done with man. He's made a completely different subclass just for humans. Remember, Linnaeus had put humans in the same grouping. He said there are no significant anatomical differences to justify putting them any further away. So he put us with the apes. But here, all these 100 years later, Owen has separated human beings off, and he's done so by virtue of claiming that there was a structure in the brain of humans that's different. A lot of scientists laughed at him and said, sorry, one structure, one organ is not enough to organize one creature so far off from the others. Every other structure is shared. That's not enough. And then his nemesis, T.H. Huxley, in the bottom right, took Owen on, toe to toe. Come on. And these two were fighting and feuding and Last year's in fact the most fun way for decades. They hated each other, absolutely loathed each other. Huxley thought that Owen was a snivelling, conservative, overly orthodox scientist who was trying to cover up the truth, to protect his ideas, and to make his rich and conservative patrons happy. Huxley saw himself as a great knight fighting for scientific objectivity and so forth. You know, the way people represent themselves is always a bit overly glossy. So anyway, so the debate centered on this structure in the brain called the hippocampus. Huxley said that it was there, and here's by the way, from a book on modern neuroscience showing the hippocampus buried in the middle of the head. Whether or not human beings had it or not was very difficult because Owen was often dealing with chimpanzee brains which were quite old and had slightly decayed. It's very difficult to dissect brains anyway in those days in particular. So it went back and forth whether or not humans had this different structure or not, and eventually Huxley demonstrated to the satisfaction of the scientific community that no, human beings didn't have anything unique in our brains that the apes don't have. And it was largely accepted that Owen had been defeated. But this went on and on through the magazines and so forth. One would write a letter bashing the others. You know, that his dissections were so amateurish. You can't see anything in this. It's completely wasted. He doesn't know what he's talking about anyway. And then the other one would write a response, go back and forth on this obscure topic of the anatomy of ape and human brains. So it became so notorious that Charles Kingsley, who I mentioned before, remember he's the cleric who wrote to Darwin and said that his theory in origin of species was a more noble view of the creator. Well, the same author wrote this very popular book, The Water Babies, which I don't think any of you have heard of, but for many generations it's a very popular children's book, which actually works evolution into this fairy tale about a poor boy falls into the chimney sweep, he falls into the bedroom of a pretty girl in a nice family, and she's cleaning. And he's never seen a clean person. He's quite shocked. Anyway, he dies and goes into the river and he turns into one baby. It's very complicated. Anyway, in the midst of this story, Kingsley, because it's a fairy tale, he pokes fun at the debate between Owen and Huxley and refers to what he calls the great hippopotamus test as a joke. It's not hippopotamus, it's hippocampus. And so here's an illustration showing Owen on the left and Huxley on the right, examining one of these mythical water babies that Kingsley had invented for his book. Little watery babies that live in water, like little fairies. So there they are, about to probably dissect this unfortunate water baby. Okay, same year, 1863, our old friend, Charles Lyell, the geologist, published his own book, which he thought would address all of these big questions that were being debated. In his book, The Geological Evidences of the Antiquity of Man, which, if I translate that into modern English, is something like the geological evidence for how long human beings have been around, how ancient are humans, in other words. Until comparatively recently for them, all the evidence seemed to show that human beings were extremely recent. Remember that diagram I showed you from Buckland's book with all the strata? And that only that little tiny white layer at the top is where human beings that ever been found. Well, that's true. That is still true. But by this time, this is now more than 30 years later, so much more evidence had been found that it was obvious that human beings had been on the earth for a very, very long time. Not just 10,000, but maybe 20, 50, 60, many thousands. So their notion of how long human beings on the earth was vastly stretched by the new evidence that they found. And once again, I just want to reiterate, like the age of the earth, this time question was not a religious issue. They had no problem at all with it being longer or shorter, because that didn't make any difference to the way you interpreted the Bible or how you perceived these events. So the amount of time was not that big a deal, although you might sometimes hear that it was for them, but it wasn't. But anyway, so they had found archaeological traces of early humans, and they were even starting to find tools that were made from stone. So it appeared that human beings had existed for a very long time, and that the earliest ones had a very primitive culture or technology, indeed, just things made of stone and wood, and very, very basic things, very basic, just a rock that's been slightly chipped to make it function. Now, Lyle thought he was being pretty radical in making this point, but he was still too conservative to come out openly on what he said in conversation with Darwin, which was that he was pretty largely persuaded that Darwin's theory was probably correct. He wouldn't say so in print, and Darwin was really annoyed with his old friend and mentor, who was so influential and so famous. Why wouldn't he say in his new book what he says to me in person, that he thinks I'm right? Instead, he sort of hedged his bets. These topics are very interesting for the studying the fascinating new theory of Mr. Darwin's. So he wouldn't really come out on the side of Darwin. But nevertheless, this book is an early contribution on the longer ancestor or history of humans, but he wasn't someone who accepted human evolution. Huxley was. The same year, Huxley published this book, Man's Place in Nature. This is the first book on human evolution. And this image is the frontispiece, the front of his book, which represents the great apes and humans. So on the left, oh, by the way, they're not drawn to scale, as Huxley indeed says. If you put them on the scale, some of them will be too small to really see. So the gibbon on the left has been enlarged so that they're all kind of the same size, so that you can compare how similar their skeletons and the arrangements of their bones are. The left is a gibbon, next is an orangutan, chimpanzee, the gorilla, and finally a human being on the side. Look how similar they are. This is not new. This has been this sort of comparison of the skeletons of humans and great apes have been in print for centuries by this time. But never before in a context in which, of course, evolution was being seriously discussed. And Huxley was arguing not that these were our ancestors, Darwin and Huxley and them, they never thought that the modern apes, that we came from them, but that we were all in the same family and maybe had common ancestors, shared ancestors. So Huxley's book went on to examine not just the skeletons, but the internal structure and the organs of chimpanzees and humans, taking another swipe. Actually, he was quite polite about Owen in this particular book. And here, looking at the pelvises of a man and a gorilla, given skulls and so forth, the similarities were overwhelming. In the hands and so forth. I mean, it is striking to see these images even today. So Huxley made the point that we like to think of ourselves as so different from everything else in nature, but if you actually compare living things and count up all the similarities and so forth, there can be no doubt that human beings are more similar to gorillas and chimpanzees than they are to a dog. Not even close. They're vastly more different from those other animals than they are from us. They're extremely close to us in every detail. So, Huxley went on to say, it's obvious that we must have all evolved from common ancestors. That's the only way to explain how we have so many features in common, so overwhelmingly many. So that's fantastic. This curious creature is also in his book, which you may not recognize. This is the first Neanderthal fossil ever found. and it's included in Huxley's book. I will discuss this at great length in the lecture on human evolution, but for the time being, I'll give you a little one of my secret tips, which is the correct way to pronounce this word is not Neanderthal, but Neanderthal. So forget the TH, just pretend the T, because it simply means Neander Valley in German. The word for valley in German is Tal. So Neander Valley. And the old spelling in German was used TH. Nowadays they use T. So English speakers, when they read that word, they come to themselves. You now know better than everyone else, and the rest of your classes use it if you can, or not if you don't want to. Anyway, so the Neanderthal was the first fossil of another hominid, another human-like creature that was not our species. And so there's a lot of debate about this. What the hell was this? Is this a gorilla? No, no way. It was some kind of human-looking, ape-looking thing. A bit like the Archaeopteryx. The Archaeopteryx had characteristics of more usual kind of dinosaurs and of birds. This fossil had features that looked ape-like, at least from the little bits that they had. They had more than just this piece of skull. They had leg bones as well. It seemed to have attributes of humans and of apes. Same thing was happening there. But Huxley was convinced that this was not a human ancestor, and so he did not put it there. Anyway, we'll talk about that on the lecture. The other big thing to be found around the same time, during the following decade, was a huge number of fossils that were uncovered in North America on horses. This is a diagram from a Victorian book on the left, showing the fossilized leg bones of these creatures from the horse family. And what this provided was something that the other cases didn't. Now, the Archaeopteryx filled a gap where there was nothing known that connected birds to other dinosaurs before, and the Archaeopteryx fit in the middle. But what these horse fossils seemed to do was to provide a gradual sequence of how things evolved over time. So the oldest creature was called, originally it was called Eohippus, I think it's called Orohippus, on the bottom left. You see this? Look at that. This is a horse-like creature, the size of a dog, which has multiple toes. I don't know how many of you have seen a horse up close, but they have a hoof. So this creature, everything else about it, man, we horsey, but it's got these multi-toes, and it's dog-sized. And then over the geological time, they found these different species that had a gradual loss of toes. So you see the Mesohippus, the toes are smaller, and in the next one, the Miocene, the Myohippus, has the center one is becoming enlarged, the other one is smaller. Go up a step, they're even smaller still. The center one is the tip of the toe is being used more than the side ones for fast running and efficient running. And then you get up to the Pliocene, where you've got something very similar to the modern horse, in which basically the other digits are just internal little bones now. And it's a hooked, single hooked animal. And then the very top one is a modern horse. So, and you can see from the picture on the right, these tiny little dog-sized things gradually evolved into much larger animals with a single hoof. So this is something that was very interesting both for Darwin and his supporters, that they had found what they wanted to find, which is very difficult to find, which was a family that could be seen to be evolving in the fossil record. So this is another kind of missing evidence gap that they found. And if you like to watch documentaries, there's actually quite a good one on this. They're old now, called Walking with Beasts. There was a sequel to Walking with Dinosaurs. Check it out. I'm sure everything's on YouTube nowadays anyway, so have a look. They show a computer-generated version of the small one. the society
It's
of
like 6
animals.
episodes. Let me
And
just
they lived in South America, which at that ancient time was a continent on its own. And the top predator there was, the largest predator animal was a bird, a sort of flightless thing like a killer ostrich. It was called a terror bird because its beak is terrifying. And as the narrator, I mean, they just couldn't resist this, could they? And the film, it's shot like a natural history documentary. All the case, that really was CGI. But they couldn't resist having the line of the terror bird coming and saying, "This is a world in which birds eat horses." Which is true, although they were very tiny horses and very big birds. But have a look, it's quite good documentary. It fills in a gap in the history of life that one doesn't normally see. You always see ancient things, like dinosaurs and so forth, and modern animals. But this era, in the middle of the early ages of Romanian life usually not very well covered. Okay, now amidst all this debate, all these discoveries, all these different opinions about Darwin's book, there are many ways for a historian to gauge how were opinions, how were scientific decisions or views changing this way or that and so forth. Here's one very interesting indicator from Darwin's book itself. In the third edition of The Origin of Species in 1861, Darwin wrote, "The great majority of naturalists believe that species are immutable productions." That means that they are unchangeable productions, unchangeable creations, unchangeable things. The great majority of naturalists believe that species do not change, they do not evolve, and that they have been separately created. By the fifth edition of 1869, he had to change that sentence to say, "Until recently, the great majority of naturalists believed that species were immutable productions." So within 10 years of the publication of his book, which was very, very radical, very controversial to many, but within 10 years, things had changed. And it was no longer Darwin and a few of his supporters arguing against the majority. Within 10 years, that had shifted, and the ground was much more even, and indeed was moving quite rapidly, especially with all the discoveries that are now used today, towards a different majority, in which the majority of scientific opinion was that Darwin was basically, on the whole, correct. Not in every detail, but some people didn't like natural selection, Asa Gray didn't like the variations being caused by natural causes, he wanted them to be caused by God and so forth. But on the whole, Darwin was convincing the international scientific community. By the 1870s, basically, evolution, or what Darwin more commonly liked to call common descent, think of the fact that you are descended from your grandparents. You and your cousins are commonly descended from your grandparents. Does that make more sense? Common descent with change. That's Darwin's name for it. Common descent with change. Modification. But anyway, natural selection itself was not that popular. What people were accepting in these years was just evolution itself, evolution per se. But Darwin's particular explanation for much of it, he thought that natural selection was the primary, but not the sole cause driving evolution, was very unpopular. And not so many naturalists accepted that at first. That was much harder for him to swallow than simply to accept that, okay, he has convinced us that evolution has happened and does happen. The evidence for that was very good now, by this time, with all the things that, and I just outlined a handful today. So the evidence for that was very convincing. But that it was happening by this cause of natural selection that Darwin suggested. It's very difficult to see that in the fossil record. It's very difficult to imagine that in many cases. and it's very difficult, sometimes very difficult to observe. Although you remember from my story about the starlings in my background, always that difficult. I tell you that, starlings in my background. Perfect example. So, many historians have argued that Darwin's theory of natural selection was simply Victorian social values of competitive capitalism and the weak to the wall applied to biology. Historians love that kind of theory because they get to make politics the controlling factor in everything. I don't find that very convincing. I think Darwin's theory is to be traced to his study of the natural world. And we have an excellent documentary record, as you can see on Darwin online, looking through his notebooks. And here's just an argument I think that will be easy for you to assess. If Darwin had borrowed from the prevailing view of the times that competition is good, the strong should win, the weak should lose, and so forth, if Darwin simply borrows this common view of society and applies it to nature and then shares it with everyone, how come that's the part almost nobody accepts? I don't think that makes sense. I think it's a false argument, a very tempting one, that Darwin's theory is borrowing from the social views of his times and applied to biology. I don't see it myself. Okay, now, I think I shared with you in an earlier lecture that Wallace went to a scientific meeting in the 1870s and wrote to Darwin, oh God, it's getting quite boring now. We don't have any of those good debates that we used to have because there's no opponents to evolution left who know anything about science. Remember I shared that quote with you from Wallace? And this is one of the most important points about this entire module that I want you to remember vividly, because it's not something that's as widely known as it should be. It's not the way that this whole story is represented in modern media and so forth, which is that you always get this picture that evolution is controversial, or something like that. There's a lot of debate on it. You get the idea that Darwin came out with this book, and people have been fighting over it ever since. It's always been this controversial theory, right? That's not true. The scientific debate, I'm speaking as a historian, the scientific debate in the international community over evolution was over in the 1870s. Evolution has not been a scientifically contested issue or view since the 1870s. And this is very widely forgotten. That the evidence that they had in Victorian times, available to Darwin and his many colleagues and supporters of faith, post fossils, and the Archaeopteryx, and all these other things, was, and Darwin, and most of all, most powerfully of all, was Darwin's book itself, with its amazing range of evidence and arguments, compiled for 20 years. It's a lot of work. Convinced the international scientific community that evolution was true. So overwhelmingly, so persuasively, that it has never been contested since then. Now I'm speaking as a historian. This is a historical fact. I'm not trying to make an argument about the issue of evolution. I'll talk about that in later lectures. Right now I'm making a point about history. That is what has happened in the history of science. And nobody cares about that. Not enough people interview historians of science, and they should, on these topics. So when you hear mentioned in the media somewhere or online somewhere that it's controversial, well, it might be controversial with some people, of course. There's no secret about that. But what you are missing, what is probably unknown to the people you have seen debating things, is this fact. That it was, that this issue was settled so long ago and has not been debated since. So in fact, I just read on Facebook today something about some event in America was cancelled. They wanted to have an event on Darwin Day in February in some Natural History Museum, and some American intelligent design supporters complained and said that it was not fair to talk about Darwin evolution because this was a scientifically tenuous and teetering theory and so forth, and that this wasn't being represented to the public, and that wasn't fair, and so they should address this new thing called intelligent design, which I'll talk about in a later lecture. And they just got sick of the mess, and the organizers just cancelled the whole event, which I think is very sad. But what was missing, none of the people in that discussion was aware of this historical point that, quite apart from the fact that evolution is not at issue today as a fact at all, it isn't anywhere in the scientific community. Their representation of that is not true. That is not a true representation of what is accepted in the scientific community in the world today. But I think it's an interesting point that they're also missing the fact that since the 1870s, that has been the same. I think that makes the whole context much more informed and much broader, and it makes more sense. It's one thing to say what everyone nowadays agrees on or doesn't agree on in the scientific community, but it's a bigger picture to show the way it's been since over 100 years ago. So, after Darwin died in 1882, he was by that time, because he had completely turned around the views of the international scientific community, he had become hugely famous. Although there are always a few people who disagree, but not in the scientific community. So, when he died, there were hundreds of obituaries. We have most of them on Darwin's mind. They were quite interesting, the way his contemporaries assessed what he had done on the occasion of his death. These are people who had never read a biography of Darwin. It's people who had lived through the time and the events. And I think it's interesting that their accounts of his life and what he did are so consistent. Now, if people have a view of Wallace today that's consistent, that's not interesting, because they've all been reading the same popular biographies. I know the source of what they say about Wallace. That's not interesting. But if people at the time who lived through all the events, the debates, all different views, that whole spectrum of reactions, that they told the story of Darwin, so many voices, so many writers, writing obituaries independently of each other, without a common source, common biography to draw on, that they produce such a consistent picture. It's very interesting. Go and grab a random one from Darwin. I think I've chosen this one by the science writer Grant Allen, who wrote in 1859, The Origin of Species at last appeared, and under what circumstances all the world knows. It was nothing less than a revolution. The influence of his thought upon the thought of the age has far outweighed any influence ever before exerted by a single man during his own lifetime. He has revolutionized not biology alone, but all science, not science alone, but all philosophy, not philosophy alone, but human life. Man, his origin, his nature, his future hopes and realizable ideals all seem something different to the present generation from their seeming to the generations that lie behind us in the field of time. Well, of course, this is the perspective of someone who's a really strong supporter of Darwin. I'm not we know two ways of interpreting that. But still, this is a very typical obituary assessment of Darwin's life and impact. I'll give the last word to Wallace in his wonderful book, Darwinism, which he published after Darwin's death in 1889. This is Wallace's great book on evolution. It's fantastic, I must say. It's really good. I would say it's the second best book on evolution written in the 19th century after Origin of Species. And in many ways, it's a lot more accessible. And in fact, even to this day, I would say it's one of the best overviews on how we know about evolution. Check it out. It's a very excellent book. It's based on certain lectures. Anyway, at the beginning of his book, he's telling his readers what Darwinism means and so forth. And he says, in his own words, that everything has changed as a result of Darwin's work. He says, but now this has all changed. The whole scientific and literary world, even the whole educated public, accepts as a matter of common knowledge the origin of species from other allied species by the ordinary process of natural birth. The idea of special creation or any altogether exceptional mode of production is absolutely extinct. And this vast, this totally unprecedented change in public opinion has been the result of the work of one man and was brought about in a short space of 20 years. That's obvious. Of course, he's praising his old friend. I mean, it's not really single-handed, is it? I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. We've seen all these other kinds of evidence that were found today, right? And of course, his declaration that creationism is absolutely extinct, well, that was a bit optimistic. No, that's not true. But he is speaking in terms of the scientific community with which he was with. So, that's it for today. A few more copies left down in the Cambridge and I'm here to answer questions.